Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. Today we're going to pull back the mask of psychospiritual salesmanship, and I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. And the reason for doing that is we live in a time of tremendous religious contention. And I'm curious about what the alternatives are for people who are genuine spiritual seekers. What's available for you? So it won't surprise most of us that people are leaving organized religion in droves, according to the latest research information that we have. Here in the States, what we often hear, especially during times of political contest, is religion at its very worst. Anti-woman, anti-queer, anti-questions, anti-earth. No wonder people want out. They don't want to be part of that kind of institutionalized rejection and hatred. They have no interest in literally believing in a cosmology that went out of date thousands of years ago, and so on. So this creates a gap for a lot of people because on the one hand, they feel called to more, called to a sense of the sacred, a sense of the presence of something beyond human beings, but an integral part of us. Where is there for us to go? So millions of us turn to spiritual leaders of different kinds. And many of those who get the most public attention charge a lot for what they overpromise, while giving us minimal content. Books on spiritual success and how we can be both fulfilled and rich. Claims that enough of us pray together, we can stop pandemics and hurricanes. And miraculous potions by which you can be more potent, more fertile, more happy, more whatever it is, whole. That's a favorite word, holistic or holism or whole. In the Old West, they would have called that snake oil. So there's a lot of that about. And here in the States, we have a long history of miracle cures. So for us, there's a cultural component too. Now, what you often find when you either work for the organizations that push this stuff or talk to people who have, is that there's an enormous gap between the mask the organization wears and how it actually performs. So I wanted to give an example without naming any names, but there was a school I worked at and associated with, I no longer do. And it was stunning how different those two were. On the surface, a lot of talk about, come study with us for all these higher and deeper reasons, an education with soul, get to know your soul, find your sense of purpose in life, ecological responsibility, and so on and so forth. But below all this, there were faculty and staff who were badly paid, even though they had complained about it for years. There was an immense administrative distrust of staff who had proved that they could work remotely, but weren't allowed to because the climate of management at this school was that everybody had to be watched to make sure that nobody took advantage. So there was zero trust in staff. A result of that was a high turnover. Also, part of the climate of this school was about concealing its true finances, all of which were discussed behind closed doors. There were massive conflicts of interest that regulators documented. The school was constantly having to settle lawsuits brought about by unhappy students. And, even when the claims were outrageous, the school would just roll over and do it to protect its reputation, no matter how much trouble it caused. And overall, the tone of administration there was abusive and paranoid and seemed to be constantly needing chaos. And part of this was hiring favorites for upper-level positions instead of people who actually had done the job. And indiscriminate firing practices that could easily have been reported to the labor relations people but weren't. The list just goes on. Doctoral candidates basically abandoned to their dissertation. Doctoral students not informed right up front of the lack of jobs in higher ed. The school had been repeatedly scolded by regulators, and overall, it operated not just because of this convincing persona, but because of the exemplary and hardworking, overworking staff and faculty at the school. Nietzsche called it long ago when he said, "No organization can stand that's only staffed by hypocrites." So much for soul. Now, this isn't always the case. There actually are schools and programs in higher ed that do offer some of the deeper, nobler, finer, more soulful things and are legitimate. So the programs I currently work in, for instance, promise education that's deeply transformative, that involves the higher and deeper ranges of consciousness, and that comes with practical applications. That's what they promise, and that's exactly what these programs deliver. So it is possible. But the question all this raises for me is higher ed really the venue for crafting wisdom paths and for finding spiritual community, especially during such deeply troubled times? That's the question. Surely they can offer tools for doing that, no question about that. Tools and education and some training. But are they really the right venue for that? We can be fooled sometimes into thinking we have no other options. So some of us avoid a scientific career because although it probes into the deepest mysteries of Earth and cosmos, too often it becomes scientism, which is an ideology rather than a discipline. And scientism being the idea that the only real truths are those that science verifies. So it too becomes dogmatic and absolutist. So there's scientism on the one hand, there's organized religion on the other, which is just a huge disappointment for so many of us. So some of the worst candidates in the history of the United States and other countries were pushed by the religious right and enabled by the religious left. It seems sometimes as though you can do something infinitely scandalous without any fear of being called down on it by the people in your own religion. The silence around all this from religious people is just amazing, although there are notable exceptions. And as a matter of fact, those exceptions prompt another question. Can religion evolve? About psychology, the field I've spent so many decades working in, James Hillman had a comment that I always thought was particularly penetrating. He said, "The psyche moves, but does psychology?" In the same way, the spirit moves, but does religion? And it seems as though, at least part of the time, the answer is yes. So where can we look for the evolution of religion? Where can we look for spiritual paths that are about inclusivity and honoring the earth? What my students often do at this point is they turn to the mystics, which is understandable. The mystics in many different religions. And they do leave us remarkable accounts, especially about the quality of experience that's involved when you're in the presence of something sacred. We should study them for that reason alone. However, there's a very important consideration that should make us a little bit cautious as we do, which is this, that mystics tend to be conformists to their religion. They don't tend to be sort of how Abraham Maslow thought of them, as out on the progressive left, the people leading the vanguard and all that. Sometimes, but by and large, the mystics are traditionalists. Hildegard of Bingen, who is a favorite among many people because of her love of earth and nature, she was a scientist, she was a composer, a polymath, basically talented in so many different fields in which she left lasting contributions. And at the same time, she was all for the Crusades. She said so in more than one letter. Catherine of Siena, same thing. Thomas Merton was a bit different. He was more of what we would think of as interfaith and inclusive, but even he never left the church. And the same with Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote so much about our connection with the soul of the earth way in advance of what we're writing now. And he let himself be bullied into silence. He followed the rule. Stayed in his lane, as we would say these days. So the mystics aren't going to help us much in terms of envisioning alternatives for creating our own spiritual path. Now, there's a lot of spiritual self-help on the market, and you can find plenty of resources if your interest is primarily internal. There are books and courses and gurus and God knows what else to tell you how to meditate, how to reconnect with nature, how to do this, how to do that, how to watch your dreams. I teach people that. The problem here, though, is community, namely the lack thereof. And that's one of the things that religious people surface when the rest of us tell them I'm spiritual but not religious. And religious people will often ask us, where's your community? Some of us have one, some of us don't. But by and large, a lot of these efforts are individually oriented. That's one problem. Another problem is that they're disconnected with how people actually live today in terms of service. They ignore things like the need for environmental and social justice. That's a big problem, especially on a planet undergoing climate chaos that's accelerating. So plenty of spiritual resources out there. A lot of times they ride in the same cart as psychological resources, but not so community-oriented. Another place to look is in open-minded and free-spirited temples, synagogues, churches, denominations. There's a lot of those around too, so that's one possible place to go, both for spiritual techniques and for a sense of community and support. There's opportunities out there. And in their own way, they too are helping religion evolve. Some of them are actually quite ecologically minded as well. And to the best of my knowledge, we don't have a program yet, at least in the States, to train eco-spiritual directors. We have plenty of programs to change spiritual directors, but eco-spiritual, not yet. But I think it's going there. I think it'll happen. And the refreshing thing about being in these venues is that even though sometimes people won't come out and say it, it's implicit that what they do is psychologically aware, but it's beyond psychology, just as it's beyond higher ed. These venues are for people who really want to be in active relation to spirit, with a capital S, but not necessarily the universal daddy who imposes rules and sends people to hell. Or as John Steinbeck referred to that version of God, a bearded interstellar dictator. So there's plenty more options available these days. As I've looked into some of these alternatives, they leave me with lingering questions that I still want answers to. And I'm moving in a direction that I'll tell you about either later in this podcast or in a later podcast. But in terms of how do I gather up my own group of people for this? But one of the questions I'm left with is, like when I go to different websites of these different organizations, you know, Unitarian Universalist or whoever, and or even some of the pagan organizations, and they say things like, this is our creed, right? And immediately the question that comes up for me is, why do we have to have a creed? So one possible answer to that would be because we need to know how to behave. I mean, look at business as usual in the news. It's absolutely horrible, you know. Malfeasance, corruption on every side, violence. You know, we need ethical guidance of some kind. Granted, we do. Why does it have to be a creed? So one of the things I'm looking into is the possibility of a spiritual path with no creed and no belief that's authoritative. there are values for sure, certain principles. And even though I'm no longer a part of the church I grew up in, I always thought do not kill was a good idea. So values, yes, absolutely. Help those in need is another value, right? Jesus would never have been caught scorning the poor the way so-called Christians do these days in the States. So yes to values, of course. But belief is something different. So there's a distinction I make sometimes between belief and belief in. So as I've mentioned previously in these podcasts, I'm writing speculative fiction because fiction has always inspired me. I find it enchanting and translatable into real-world goals and values. It's a form of storytelling, and storytelling is powerful. So, for instance, an example I've sometimes used is in Star Trek, there's a philosophy called IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. It's a fictional philosophy. Do I believe it? No, because it's fictional. But I believe in it and what it stands for and what it calls for. It basically says diversity is not just a buzzword, it's woven into the fabric of the cosmos. It's what makes life on Earth happen. It's what we should aspire to, appreciating. And Star Trek, as at its best, does that. Doesn't always live up to the ideal, but at its best, it shows what appreciation of difference looks like. After all, if there is no difference, there would be no basis relationships at all. We would just be in this homogeneous mass with no consciousness and no love or passion. So that's a question for me. Can we have spirituality without belief? Belief is a cognitive act. Belief is like, I believe that 30 cars pass down this road an hour. And the thing about beliefs is that anybody can have them, as the Buddha pointed out. Anybody can have beliefs, anybody can have opinions, which are a type of belief. If an institution gets behind it, it's a belief. We believe this, we believe that, right? We believe that we have the ultimate truth and everybody else is wrong. We believe that our Savior is the best of all saviors and that my dad can kick your dad's ass. That's where belief gets us. Belief as an everyday thing is, of course, very useful. You couldn't get out of bed if you didn't believe that the floor would be there. But that's more of an automatic kind of belief. But the belief in big creeds that distinguish me from everybody else, those tend to be contentious. I'm more interested in spirituality without that kind of belief. And related to that, I'm interested in spirituality without idealized creeds. Right? Back in 2001, the comedian George Carlin did a bit of a bash on the Ten Commandments and argued that some of them were out of date. And so he went through them one by one and decided to evaluate those he wanted to keep. Carlin never had any lack of ego, right? And then the ones that just have to go. And so he came down to 2 commandments, which actually is a pretty good number. Thou shalt always be honest and faithful. That's the first commandment. And the second one is thou shalt try real hard not to kill anyone. And then he jokingly added, unless they pray to a different invisible man than the one you pray to. But so there's George Carlin's 2 commandments. What if there weren't commandments? What if there were moral principles that we hold each other accountable for, but they aren't considered ultimate authorities that never have any exception whatsoever? Roger Zelazny wrote a really interesting short story about something related to this. It's called The Last Defender of Camelot. And in this story, Lancelot never dies. And so he wanders the earth, taking up different occupations, always wondering why he was kept around when nobody else was. And eventually, he wanders out to England and into a certain cave on a rainy evening, and he runs into Merlin, who is just then waking up. And it turns out that Lancelot was kept alive through Merlin's magic. And Merlin lost a wizardly contest, but before he went under, he gave himself a wake-up spell. So he's waking up now in our time. And so he's talking to Lancelot about what needs to be done. And he says, we need to be true to the ideals of Camelot. We need to go out and right wrongs and punish the wicked and this and that. And so Lancelot, who's been around all this time, says, to paraphrase the story, he says, the older I get, the harder time I have figuring out who should be punished and who shouldn't be. And things are much more ambiguous and interrelated than that. In fact, the world's so interrelated now that if you go out and try to punish the wicked, you're liable to punish a bunch of good people along with them, assuming you even know the difference. And so he's more about enhancing the flow of relationships between people. That's my way of putting it. And Merlin is outraged. He says, "You're no knight. What happened to you? What happened to your oath of loyalty to the ideals of Camelot?" And the way the story goes is that, in a certain sense, Lancelot is actually more loyal to those ideals because he still stands up for fairness and justice, not for righting wrongs by force. Which is why when Merlin then tries to have him killed in magical combat, he gives Lancelot a black horse to ride. And Lancelot says, "Any horse in a storm, and I am Camelot's last defender." So for myself, I've often found that in such a complicated world where everybody has some shadow, everybody falls short, it might be easier actually to apply guidelines and values than absolute commandments that supposedly come from God or from some sacred book. And yes, by the way, I have read the entire Bible more than once, and I don't know about you, but I'm not ready to put anyone to death for violating the Sabbath, or if I had a daughter, to hand her over in marriage to the man who raped her. So spiritual paths in the past, and I'm thinking particularly of Hermeticism and Gnosticism, have emphasized the need for gnosis, which is a multidimensional word that means something like direct experiential contact with the more than human. And in Islamic Gnosticism in particular, it's directly linked to powers of imagination. And there's a distinction made between imagination in the service of the sacred and the more petty, power-driven kind that gets all of us into trouble now and then. Eco-spiritual approaches emphasize a gnosis of the sacred earth as well. And our practice of terrapsychology has brought out that dimension to some extent, although terrapsychology is psychology, not spirituality. But it can be used in service to earth-based forms of spirituality, which, the argument that often comes up here from traditional people is that that's pantheistic and God is not nature and so on and so forth. But there's plenty of people around the world who hold the divine as greater than earth or cosmos, but totally infused in it as well, which means we better take care of our little plot of ground if we expect to be here much longer. So I'm wondering about the kind of spirituality that would collect together our tools for deep reflection and gnosis and join them to fairness and service and relationality. What might that look like? In the West, there has tended to be a split between reflection and action. But don't the two need each other? And for that matter, this all sounds terribly serious, but what about a spirituality or religion of play, of creativity, of playful ritual? Does it always have to be serious? What about a spiritual path that involves mistake making? I mean, they all do. Sometimes they just punish you harder for mistakes than other times. But what if that's actually part of the path? Imperfection, part of the path. Being messy and creative, part of the path. What would that look like? No judges in 900-year-old robes arrayed against you every time you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing by their standards. And here's another idea. What about a spiritual path of deep kinship with like-minded people who may consider themselves religious and may not, but are in serve to things other than themselves? Deep kinship that doesn't charge tuition. How about that? And it doesn't require that you hand over your entire life to a religion that basically meets you where you are. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, earlier I mentioned imagination, and I put that together with gnosis, which is an inspiration from Suawardi and Ibn Arabi and other great Islamic Gnostics and visionaries. But as a matter of fact, there's a long tradition around the world that we could call the path of imaginal gnosis. It runs back to ancient Egyptian religion. It's in Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Renaissance natural magic, Islamic, and specifically Sufi forms of visionary experience, depth psychology, parapsychology, German and English Romanticism, and many others. Many other traditions. So what about imagination as a spiritual path? It's been done. Why not do it now? So I've written a little bit online about my word for all this, terranosis, right? Earth knowing. A path with no authorities, no thou shalts and thou shalt nots, no men telling women how to be women or what women should do with themselves, or for that matter, what anybody should do with themselves. Aren't we adults? Don't we determine that for ourselves? And one thing I would like built into my version of terranosis is inspiring fictions, as mentioned earlier. So, and if you heard my previous podcast, you heard all about a story I wrote called 10 Lamps. When I sat down to write it, I thought, what if I came up with some of the philosophical ideas that inspire me and really tried to condense them? 10 is all you get. Can't have 11. What would happen then? And so that's where the 10 lamps come from, actually. And part of the reason for doing it is to inspire you to create your own version or to add to the 10 lamps if you like them. And above all, to figure out more ways that we can play together and dream together and imagine together. Because it's the only way we're going to get the kind of world that we really want to live in and that we want the people to come after us to live in. The kind of world where people don't show up on your doorstep to charge you enormous prices just to be together with a few other people who have similar ideas to yours. Where spirituality is not salesmanship. Where, yes, spiritual people make a living, a good, honest living, and, given all the poor clergymen I've known in my life, maybe a better living even than that. But it's not about converting anyone to anything. It's not about being missionaries in other people's territories when you should be missionizing your own religion because it needs reforming. No, this is more about walking a path that gives you joy and reenchantment, that deepens your relationships, that prompts you to do something when you see people in trouble, and then being an example to other people. And actually, come to think of it, I seem to remember a few other people who recommended that, and they had different names. Let's see. I think one was called Jesus. There was another called Muhammad and another called Buddha, Guru Granth Sahib, Zoroaster. There's a bunch of names when you think about it. This has been recommended before. So maybe now we're ready for a fresh listening, but we can do it in a form that's less authority-driven. That's less outside of ourselves and more about our intrinsic relation to ourselves and each other and this still beautiful planet. Thank you.